Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Can you all hear me okay with this right here? Okay, great. People in the back. All right. One of my nicknames is Grandpa. I don't really know why. Some people say I have an old soul and I'm not that great with technology. So, but I always double check, do I have this on okay? And everybody can hear me. Well, it is so good to be here this morning. I've been looking forward to it. We've been excited about it. We've been talking about it. I don't know how much you all have been talking about. We've been talking about it a lot. We've been very excited to come here. Evelyn, not so much. That's our oldest daughter. And I only say that this morning, she did not want to be in the car. She was just whining a little bit, but that's okay. We're here. We're so happy to be here. And I'm happy to share a message this morning with you on the book of Nehemiah. I know that you've been studying. I believe you've gone through the first 2 chapters. Is that right? First 2 chapters? Okay, great. So some of this might be a little bit of a review, but I get so excited whenever I study these things. We're going to study the character of Nehemiah this morning, and I'll just go ahead and tell you we're not going to cover it all because I just got really excited as I was going through. And for the last 5 minutes after that first bell, I'm going to play catch up real fast. And then at the very end, I've got something I just am so excited to share with you. So side note, if you'll open up your Bible to Nehemiah chapter 2, please. Nehemiah chapter 2. As I was preparing for this, and when Caitlin and I, we studied the Bible together since we got married. That's been a really important part of our life. And I just remember whenever I read this particular verse that has, it's kind of a side note, not related to class, but in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 12, I just love this verse here. So in Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'm sorry, it's not chapter 2, it's chapter 3, verse 12. So there's my first mistake of the morning. Nehemiah 3 and verse 12. If you look at the passage, it says, next to him, Shallum, the son of Halahesh, the official of half the district of Jerusalem, made repairs, he and his daughters. And in the context there in Nehemiah chapter 2, it's talking about people rebuilding the walls, and people were building in front of their houses. And it says the sons of so-and-so helped rebuild the walls. But I just love this verse because it mentions a man and his daughters. We're expecting another little girl. And so we have 2 daughters. And this is something that I'm going to be preaching to my family. Me and my daughters are going to do some work. Not related to our class this morning, but I just had to share it. So I remember when COVID hit really, really hard, the world in 2020, there was a group of about 5 boys. I say boys because we were younger. I was one of the 5. A group of about 5 boys. We called ourselves the Band of Brothers. I don't know if you've seen the series or read the book. Great men. 3 of them are preachers right now, by the way. I include myself in that. But we were kind of locked down. We couldn't do a lot of things. We were still going to church, but we lived in different areas. And so we decided we wanted to study together, over Zoom, over Google Meet, whatever we could. And the very first book that we studied was the book of Nehemiah. And so I could just talk forever and ever and ever about the book of Nehemiah. And I love it. It is so great. Leadership skills. And since we're going to talk about the character of Nehemiah today, there's no way we can cover it all. But I'm just so excited to share with you what we have here. So instead of looking at, every single thing that happens in the book of Nehemiah, because we can't do that in this amount of time, we're going to look at the character of Nehemiah. And so I believe that you can tell a lot about a person by their actions. And so this morning, I want to talk about Nehemiah's actions. And one of my goals here, one of the things that I love to do is just show you in the text things that Nehemiah did. And then we can kind of talk about what that means about who he is. And so let's just dive right in here. The very first thing I want to say is that Nehemiah left a place of power. And so I know that you just studied chapter 1 and chapter 2, so this will be kind of a review. But in chapter 1, if you look in verse 11, the very last phrase in verse 11 of chapter 1, Nehemiah says, now I was the cupbearer to the king. And so in that time period, a cupbearer, I'm sure you all know this, very trusted position, more like an advisor. You don't just have anybody who's going to be your cupbearer. And I got to be honest with you, from my point of view, in the culture that we live in, I would think you would want somebody really expendable to be your cupbearer and taste the food first if it's poison, but that's not the way that they did things then. And so this is a very high value position, an advisor to the king. And if you look in chapter 2 and verse 5, here Nehemiah says, I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. And so here is Nehemiah in this place of authority, power, influence. And he hears about these walls in the city of Jerusalem and the people who are being despised. And he says, send me there. Instead of staying in this position of influence and power, he says, send me to this broken city because I need to rebuild. I need to help these people rebuild. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, I think that's a big deal. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Easy to say, send somebody else. Rather than thinking in terms of faith, God will make a way. Easy to excuse himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know how cushy it was, but you imagine if he has this relationship, as I know you all have studied, he has this relationship with the king that's it's not normal. Like it's very trusted. He recognizes his facial expressions. And so I don't know how cushy it was for him, but it's got to be a lot easier than rebuilding Jerusalem, as we're going to be looking some more here. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? That Nehemiah left a place of power? Okay, great. Let's go on to this next one here. The second thing is that Nehemiah felt great compassion, and you see that in his actions. So if you look in chapter 1, the first 2 verses, the very first thing that we read in the book of Nehemiah, first 2 verses, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month Chislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. And so just this right here in verse 2, you have Hanani and you have some men from Judah. And the first thing that Nehemiah asked them about, he says, how are those people doing? How are our brethren, our other people from our place, how are they doing? That's what he asked first. And then he says, how's Jerusalem? That's what he asked about. You know, you can tell a lot sometimes whenever you're in conversations with people. Maybe you've been sick, and I can't think of a good example, but maybe you've been sick and you just come back into the church building and somebody says, well, I need you to lead singing today and do this and this and this. Not that there's anything bad with, you need to lead singing, but man, I've just been sick. What? And you're worried about what I need to do or this and that. It's like, how about a little, how you doing, man? Right? You can tell a lot about somebody. And when somebody genuinely cares about what you're going through or have gone through, and here Nehemiah does that. And not only that, if you'll look in, let's see, chapter 1, verse 4. So after he hears about the walls of Jerusalem are torn down, the people are despised, their reproach, verse 4 says, when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for days. I think in our common time right now, we would say that if you tell somebody that your people are despised or the people of God are being persecuted across the world, we might feel really sad about that for how long? Maybe 30 minutes in the moment. And I think we would all say that's commendable that this person is really being affected by this. But here's Nehemiah, and he weeps and mourns for days. Wow. I mean, this is a man who felt great compassion and was very sensitive to the needs of his people. And that's one of his strengths. And if you look in chapter 2, the first couple of verses here, kind of alluded to this earlier, it came about in the month Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. And then I was very much afraid. So not only does Nehemiah feel this great compassion, you see it in his weeping and his mourning, but even the king can see it on his face. He is visibly disheartened. And so Nehemiah felt great compassion. I think that says a lot about him. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on Nehemiah feeling this great compassion? Okay. And I know that that's kind of a review for you here in the first 2 chapters. So maybe we'll get a little bit more as we talk here into some later chapters. But another thing that Nehemiah did, some of his actions, is that he prayed diligently. One of the things that I love about Nehemiah is he is a praying man. And one of my favorite things about the types of prayers that he prays, several different times throughout the text, it's either right before something big happens or it's right after something big happens. Nehemiah says, I need to talk to God. And so if you'll look at a couple examples with me here in chapter 1 and in verses 5 through 11, we won't read the whole thing here, but right after hearing about the walls of Jerusalem are down and they're rubble and the people are despised and there are reproach among men, the first thing he does is he prays. And I don't believe that this is the only time that Nehemiah prayed, but this is the only one we have recorded. And so he prays this just amazing prayer, confessing his sins, the sins of all the people of Israel. And he just says, please remember your promises and help us do what we need to do. And so it's just absolutely an amazing prayer here. But look in chapter 2 with me in verse 4. So right after the king asked him, he's like, why is your face sad? You're not sick. So this is just sadness of the heart. And Nehemiah says, this is what's going on. And the king says, okay, what do you request? What do you want from me? Here in verse 4, the king said, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And we don't have recorded exactly what he said. We don't know how long it was, but I just imagine that if the king asked him and he spent 30 minutes praying about it, that'd be kind of a weird, segue into asking what he wanted. So it seems like, we don't know this, but it seems like just in that moment, Nehemiah may have just said a short little prayer. Oh, Lord, please help me. Please protect me. Please let whatever is about to be said affect this king in the way that you would have it. Whatever he did. And then he says, please let me go to Jerusalem and rebuild. He takes just however long it is, but he takes just that few short moments to pray. And I wonder for myself how often I do that. Or really, let's be honest here, how often I don't do that when I should. Like, here's this big decision we've got to make in just 3, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, however long it is. But Nehemiah thought that was important. If you'll turn with me to chapter 4. Chapter 4, after hearing taunts from enemies of those who would rebuild the wall, namely Tobiah and Sanballat, several different times, Nehemiah prays after their threatening and taunting. So in Nehemiah chapter 4, if you look at verse 4, so right after Tobiah is saying, hey, if a fox were to jump on that wall, it would break. It's not strong. There's nothing that will hold this thing up. Verse 4, hear, O God, how we are despised. Return their reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity and let not their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders. And that's just an amazing prayer that he prays. But further down in verse 9, again, Sanballat, Tobiah, some other people here, they are very angry. You see at the end of verse 7, they're very angry that the breaches of the wall are being closed and all of this work is being done. And so Nehemiah, verse 9, but we pray to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. We could go through this whole book in chapter 5, verse 19, after Nehemiah has done all of these great things, set up so many wonderful things for these people that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I don't want to go into too much detail here. But in chapter 5, verse 19, Nehemiah says, remember me, oh my God, for good, according to all that I've done for this people. He prays. He sees the importance of that. Tobiah and Sanballat, they don't give up. They face so much opposition. Chapter 6 and over in verse 9 says, for all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work and it will not be done. But Nehemiah says, but now, oh God, strengthen my hands. Just these short prayers after these discouraging things happen. Nehemiah thinks that's important. Chapter 9 is just this amazing prayer. It's not really Nehemiah specifically, but Nehemiah had a part in it. We could just read chapter 9 for this entire time and go through what it says and how amazing it is, but amazing prayer. And then again, in the end of the book, chapter 13, there's about 3 different prayers that Nehemiah prays. And so does anybody have any thoughts or anything that they want to add to this point, that Nehemiah was a man of prayer and he prayed diligently?
All this is good in that it reflects well on Nehemiah's character. And you think about Nehemiah, shows you what the person is, but then the application is that we want to have these qualities as well. We want to be willing to give up power. We need to be people of great compassion. They need to be people who pray all the time. And look at examples of Nehemiah really looking for opportunities to pray. It shows that, we talk about pray without ceasing, and you're like, I just pray without ceasing. That's not simple, but it shows that you can look to find moments to pray. You can pray. You can probably all pray. I know I can pray a lot more than we did. Look for those opportunities to pray.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Anybody else?
Last we talked about prayers called arrow prayers.
Arrow prayers. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for saying that. Anybody else on praying diligently? Sir?
I was thinking about, Mike talked about sort of our thoughts on this one, but I'm also trying to think about like specifically why this book was written and why this was important to God's people at that time, and Nehemiah's character being written and how that's important to the people because they're coming back and they're sort of wishy-washy in their steadfastness in a way, to like building the temple, not building the temple. That's the thing. And like, and this is the kind of character that God really wants in his people. So I think that's also interesting that using him as an example for the people, try to get them ready also for the temple of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love where your head just went at the end there. If you just pocket that, that's like the last 5 minutes. Yeah, I love that. So thank you. No, I'm happy you said that. That was awesome. Thank you so much. And so Nehemiah prayed diligently. I love the application side of it. That's also where we're going to go after all these nice little bullet points are up here, is that we absolutely need to be doing every single one of these things. And that's why it's important to look at these characters in the Bible. Anybody else on that Nehemiah prayed diligently? I love, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One thing that occurs to me is you consider the timeline of Nehemiah, the book, and the time that he's living. He is not old enough to have been one of the exiles, the original exiles. He may have been born in this land. And so in Nehemiah 1:1, we get his father's name, Hakaliah. And so that really speaks to possibly his father teaching him about his people, where they came from, what led them here. That gives him that sense of longing for his people and their well-being, even though he may never have been a part of that community.
Wow. Yeah.
And so his willingness to pray diligently and feel great compassion for those people that are hundreds of miles away, even though he has most likely been raised in this scenario. It speaks a lot about his character, the character of his family, and God's purpose for families, in that one of the reasons they went away was because the parents weren't teaching their children. And so here we have potentially a parent that's teaching his child, and his child becomes a great part of the story.
Wow, that's great. And that's not even something that I remotely thought of as I was preparing for this. So thank you so much for saying that. That was a great point. You should be up here instead. I don't even, what am I doing up here? That's awesome. Thank you. Anybody else on praying diligently? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to this next one here. And again, we could talk about each one of these. We could talk about just one chapter for years. So in no way am I trying to cover everything. But this one is probably one of my favorite ones. And this one, I know I could just preach it to you for hours and hours and hours. So one of the things that I love about Nehemiah, not only does he pray to God, and we see it over and over and over and over again in the book, that he says, remember me, oh my God, for the good that I've done. And he, before something big happens, he prays and he says, God, strengthen my hands. Or after something bad happens, he says, hey, remember these enemies. But also just in everyday conversation, Nehemiah takes, it seems like, every opportunity to point back to God. He reveres him so much that he just takes every opportunity to mention God in situations where most people wouldn't. And so I'd just love to show you some examples of this. In chapter 2 and verse 8. Chapter 2, verse 8. So the king, he asks of the king to let him go to Jerusalem and rebuild. And he asks for, honestly, it's a really big ask. He asks him for timber. He asks him for building materials. He asks for protection on the way. And so here in verse 8, a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I go. Right here. And the king granted them to me, not because of the relationship that him and the king had, not because of any kind of thing the king was doing, but because the good hand of my God was on me. Here's a situation where, again, he's the cupbearer. He's in a place of authority. He's in a place of influence. He very easily could have said, well, look, I just hand that cup over to the king so nicely that the king loves me. And he said, you know what, Nehemiah, take all the stuff you want and go. But he doesn't do that. He says all this worked out because the hand of God was on me. And it's too good, isn't it? It's just too good. But that's not the only example. It's everywhere. And look with me over in, let's see here. Go to we're still in chapter 2. Look at verse 12. Same chapter, verse 12. So he is in Jerusalem at this point. It's the middle of the night. And he decides, he doesn't tell anybody what he's doing, but he decides that he's going to inspect the walls, see the damage, really see for himself what's going on. Here in verse 12. So I came to Jerusalem and was there. I'm sorry, verse 12. I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. And there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. A really interesting language to me here. He says, I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do. Again, here's a great opportunity for Nehemiah to say, look, I was cupbearer to the king. Y'all need to listen to me because I've got all this influence and here's all this stuff that I got. Here's what I want to happen. But here, first of all, he doesn't even tell anybody what he's about to do, which I think is a huge thing about his character anyway. But then here in verse 12, he says, I didn't tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do. Not what I thought of for myself that I want to do. Now, how many times do we use the word I whenever we're talking? It's probably embarrassing. If you're anything like me, it's probably embarrassing. So here in verse 12, he says, my God put this into my mind. And sometimes I think in our circles of, how we talk about religious things, maybe we're a little scared of this type of language. God was putting this into my mind. God was putting this into my heart to do this. And here we have Nehemiah doing that. And it's a great and wonderful thing that's happening. And maybe we ought to do that a little bit more. I have so many examples of this I would just love to show you and talk about forever. But let's see here. Look with me still in chapter 2, look down at verse 18. Down in verse 18. So whenever Nehemiah reveals the plans that he wants to do because of what God had put into his mind, verse 18, he told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. And they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. So again, here's Nehemiah, perfect opportunity to tell these people, I'm great, I want to rebuild the wall. But he says, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me. How all these things are working out, not because he's so great or because he has so much influence, but because God is great and he has the influence and has been favorable to him. And jump down to verse 20. So I answered them and I said, talking to the enemies, Tobiah and Sanballat, he says, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. So again, here's these enemies threatening him, saying, what are you doing? You're rebelling against the king. What are you doing? He says, hey, our God, he's going to give us success. Nothing about me is going to bring the success. Nothing about these people, nothing about this city is going to bring success, but it's God that's going to do it. And so it's just amazing. He's constantly just pointing up, right? It's great. So amazing. Anybody have any comments on this so far? I've got a bunch more, but I want to make sure we have some back and forth. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And how can we help but to, when we realize the truth that there's nothing in and of ourselves that is worth or can do anything, it's all God, how can we help it? And Nehemiah shows that. Any other comments before we do maybe a few more?
Thank you for that point. I think it's a great topic to bring out. I think a lot of houses have taken that point and running it too far. And therefore you sometimes I feel a little gun shy about going this way. Thankful here that people are going to run with that off into some heresy, but no, it has to be said probably what it is that, all the things are being done by God.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you for being vulnerable and saying that. I know it's not easy to say that all the time, but I mean, absolutely. If there's anybody who's guilty of being gun shy, as you said, it's me. Think about all the people I've met in the past. I'm kind of like, oh, I don't want to say it that way because then they're going to think ... right? So thank you for that very much. Anybody else? Okay, let's look at a few more then, because actually, let me just double check the time here. Oh man, this is too good, isn't it? I would just do this forever, right? This is too good. Okay, so look at Let's look at chapter 6. So this is on the same point here that Nehemiah reveres God, and he's constantly redirecting glory away from himself to God. But there's another part of revering God in Nehemiah's character that we see in his actions, is that he respects and reveres God's law as well. Something that, as you pointed out, must have been taught to him because he didn't live probably in Jerusalem, and a lot of the teaching wasn't happening, and that's why the exile happened. So thank you for that point. It's great. It brings right over here. So in chapter 6, look at verse 10. There is a couple people who are trying to make Nehemiah talk to Sanballat and talk to Tobiah, these enemies, and try and work things out. And so in chapter 6 and verse 10, when I entered the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined at home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you at night. So before we even keep going here, this person is telling Nehemiah, hey, these guys, they're going to come here, they're trying to kill you, so let's hide in the temple. And he says specifically in the temple, not like outside in the big temple area. He says, let's hide in the temple. Anybody have red flags going off in their head already? Big no-no. You can't do that. You're not from the right tribe, whatever it is. So right here, look at verse 11. But Nehemiah said, should a man like me flee? And could one such as I go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat hired him. He was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly and sin, so that they might have an evil report in order that they could reproach me. And since we're here, he prays. Right after this huge event happens, he prays. Remember, oh my God, Tobiah and Sanballat according to their works. And it's just very imprecatory is the fancy word for it. He's just condemning them. God, don't forget their sins. So here's Nehemiah. People have been trying to kill him. They've been trying to assassinate him. They've been trying to discourage him and all the workers. And so here's this person who says, hey, I'm here. I'm on your side. I want to protect you. Let's go hide in the temple so they can't come and get you. And Nehemiah says, no, I'm not of the right birth. I can't do that. Did you see where it said in, let's see, what verse is it? In verse 13, that would be sin. That would be breaking the law for him to go into the temple like that. He says, no, I'm not going to go in. And so he says, there's no way this guy is a prophet from God. This prophecy can't be from God because God wouldn't have me sin like this. That's awesome, isn't it? It's huge. And that says so much about his character, that he respects God's law. He reveres God in such a way that even when it might be something that would take his life, he says, no, I'm not going in. Any thoughts on that? It's good, isn't it? It's just too good. We can talk about this forever. Okay. I'll tell you what. Let's look at chapter 6. We're already there. Look at verse 16. There's so many more. If you want some of these notes, I'm happy to share them with you just so you can see this as well. But in verse 16 of chapter 6, when all our enemies heard of it, actually, let's do verse 15 so we get better context here. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul in the 52 days. When all our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Here he is again. He's just redirecting praise to where it truly belongs. And this really makes me think of, let your light so shine before men so that they may see your good works and glorify the God in heaven. You see that? Because it says they lost their confidence because they recognized that this work had the hand of God on it. Just amazing. So good. Oh, man. I'm telling you, we're running out of time. I just want to keep talking about this. This is so good, isn't it? So one more thing on this, actually. If you look in chapter 13, over in chapter 13, when there are people who are breaking the law in multiple different facets, we won't go into it on this point, but people are breaking the law in multiple different facets. Nehemiah has some pretty strong reactions to that. If you'll look down in verse, look in verse 25, chapter 13, verse 25. We could argue here that he probably went a little far with this, but the point is still the same. Verse 25, I contended with them and I cursed them and I struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. And so here, talking specifically about marrying foreigners who were not proselytes, so people who had not converted to the God of Israel. And so he strikes some of them, pulls some of their hair, and cursed them. Again, we'd probably say that's a little far. But yet, his zeal for the law of God was so high, so strong. Nehemiah is a man who just revered God and recognized his authority and his power. Are there any thoughts on that point? Always like make sure, because I know sometimes there's people who are afraid to just speak out. They kind of like have their hand up a little, just a little right here, like, oh, there he is. Okay, so let's go on to this next point here, is that Nehemiah led by serving. And this is something that I've read through Nehemiah, I don't know how many times, and I probably skipped over this a little bit. And if you look with me, we won't go to all the points that I have here, but look in chapter 5. Look at chapter 5 with me. And we'll start in verse 9. Chapter 5, look at verse 9. Let's see. Okay, so right here, there are people who are charging interest on their Jewish brethren. And so here they are, they had just been, I guess, redeemed and come back to this land, and people don't have enough food, they don't have enough money. And so people are lending it to them, but with interest. And if you remember the old law, you should not be charging interest on fellow Jews. And so here in verse 9, Nehemiah says, again, I said, the thing which you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? And then jump down there to verse 15 with me. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them the bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also applied myself to the work on this wall. We did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now that which was prepared for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also birds were prepared for me. And once in 10 days, all sorts of wine were furnished in abundance. Yet for all this, I did not demand the governor's food allowance, because the servitude was heavy on this people. Again, he prays right here. Remember me, oh my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. And so here, Nehemiah is the governor of this place. And as the governor, he has the right to a food allowance. He has the right to charge people some taxes and gain some things from them. But as we just read, Nehemiah doesn't do that. He says, what we're doing already is enough. And not only does he say, you all go work on the wall over here, in verse 16, I also applied myself to the work on this wall. We didn't buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. So right after talking about these Jews who were using this situation as an opportunity to get more money, to get more food, to acquire more stuff, Nehemiah says, even the thing that I had a perfect right to, the governor's allowance. He had every right to that food. Instead of doing that, you know what he does in verses, 17 and 18? He holds these feasts for people. He feeds people. He's actually lending money and lending food to people and not charging interest, which is, again, goes back to the old law. That's what you should have been doing anyway. And so it's just amazing, an amazing part of his character that, again, here's this guy who came from influence, came from authority and power. And here he is, he still has a position of power and authority, and he doesn't even take what's rightfully his. Just amazing. He gives that back to the people and really gives it to God in the same process. Sir?
He's a prayer warrior, and he always puts feet to the prayers. He's always that true love and faith always with prayers, but giving God all the glory. Highest that we can do is glorify God.
Yeah, amen.
And strength, the source, the person, everything good is from God. But God wants us to be instruments, and he is clearly ready to be used, courageous. He rolls up his sleeves and he builds with them. He serves, sacrifices. And so the prayers are not just, Lord, take care of this. It's use me, let me, help me,
strengthen me. It's all about let me be the instrument. And that's we glorify God, looking to his source. It begins with God. We're the instrument, and we glorify God. What we do say after.
Yeah, that's great. Again, why am I even up here? You should be up here teaching this class. It's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any comments on this point? Okay. Well, I have more that I could talk. What time do we go to? I don't want to, I'm telling you. Oh, great. We got plenty of time, right? We can cover this whole book right now. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to this next point here, is that Nehemiah faced great opposition. We've been talking about it all morning. We have been, but he did. He faced great opposition. So immediately, go back to chapter 2, please. As soon as he comes back to Jerusalem, right? I mean, just as soon as he gets there, if you look with me in chapter 2, verse 10. Verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. And then look at verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. So it's not super clear to me. I'll just be upfront with everybody here. If he was already in Jerusalem whenever these people heard about it, or if he was on the way, because just as soon as he is even on the way or there's people who are his enemies. They probably don't even know who Nehemiah is personally. And yet, because of what he's doing, opposition right away. And it's just from the first second he even sets foot in Jerusalem, he has enemies. And he has to face this. And throughout the whole book, we see it. We talked about over in chapter 2, how there's different verses where they're really displeased. Look in chapter 2, verse 19. We read all the verses around this, but we didn't read verse 19 yet. So verse 19, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and they despised us. And they said, what is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And so again, probably not a legitimate question. Are you rebelling against the king? All right, guy. It's probably not what their main concern is, because we see in verse 10 where their heart really is. People are seeking the welfare of Jerusalem. No, this is very displeasing in their sight. And over in chapter 4, we see these planned attacks that these people are doing. It's not just verbal or emotional damage that these people are inflicting. In chapter 4, look at the first 3 verses. It came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, even what they're building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. And now jump down to verse 7. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on and that the breaches began to close, they were very angry. All of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause a disturbance in it. And so jump to chapter 6. Chapter 6. And we won't read all of this, but we read part of this earlier where they're planning to assassinate Nehemiah. He is such a good leader. They're like, we got to pick him off, and then all this work is not going to work out. So in chapter 6, if you'll look at the first couple of verses here with me. Now, when it was reported to Sanballat, Tobiah, to Geshem the Arab, and to the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, then Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, come, let us meet together at Chephirim in the plain of Ono. But they were planning to harm me. There it is right there, verse 2. They were planning to harm me. So I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? They sent messages to me 4 times in this manner, and I answered them in this manner. And so it's just, these people are planning harm. And again, we see a little bit of Nehemiah's character in verse 3. He says, I am doing a great work and I can't leave and do this stuff. So again, leadership out the wazoo. He's just awesome. Nehemiah is so great. But he's facing this opposition where people are actually trying to kill him. It's not just, sometimes we talk about the persecution that we face today, which is just nothing in comparison. It's legitimate that we do face some, but wow, some of the stuff that they faced, it was life, death. And Nehemiah stayed strong and kept his head where he needed to be. Any thoughts on this point? He faced great opposition. Okay. All right. Well, let's actually no, we've got to look at this. I was going to move on, but look at chapter 6. Look at verse 15 with me. Oh, wow. I'm telling you, time flies. This is just too good, isn't it? Nehemiah chapter 6, look at verse 15 with me. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. This right here, verse 17. Also, in those days, many letters went from the nobles of Judah to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. Verse 18, check this out. For many in Judah were bound by oath to Tobiah, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Era, and his son Johanan, had married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. So not only is he facing this external opposition and challenge, there are snakes in the garden, if you will. People who are his relatives, who have influence in Jerusalem, are also here. And we got to turn here too while we're over here. Look in chapter 13. So it's not enough that there's these people who are being influenced by Tobiah, but also it has a big effect in the world here. So in Nehemiah 13, if you look at verse 4, now prior to this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. And so here's a man who has a room in the temple where these holy articles were supposed to be held, but because he's related to somebody, he's defiling the temple. This is a really huge deal. And not just that, but also if you look at, let's see, I don't want to steal too much thunder here. We got to move on because we're just running out of time. Okay, let's do this last one. Nehemiah left and he comes back in judgment. And I think this says a lot about Nehemiah's character. So right here in chapter 13 where we are, if you look at verse 6, so right after what we just read about Eliashib putting up a place for Tobiah in verse 6, during all this time, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. And after some time, however, I asked leave from the king. So first of all, let's just talk about how Nehemiah left. And so some people might say, okay, they were doing all this work. They did all of this stuff. And then Nehemiah just leaves. What a weak leader. No way. If you remember back in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, whenever he asked leave from the king, he said, okay, when are you going to be back? Now, we don't get in the text here, we don't get when he said he was going to come back. But Nehemiah does. He's a man of his word. He has a sense of duty about him that he told this pagan ruler, I'm going to come back. And he does. And so when he's gone, I can't even think of the phrase right now because I'm so excited about this, but what is it when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? And we see that. Because when Nehemiah is gone, you have so many things that go wrong, just like Eliashib preparing a place for Tobiah. Look with me in, look at verse 10. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service, they had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and I said, why is the house of God forsaken? I gathered them together and restored them to their posts. And he sets it up to where it would be the way it was supposed to be. So the Levites and the singers, all of these people were supposed to be tithing to pay these people and take care of them. And they just hadn't been doing that. And so the Levites and the singers, they said, well, we're going to just go to our own fields. And so he comes back and says, what are you doing? This is not what the law has prescribed for us to do. And further than that, if you look in verse 15, in those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain, loading them on donkeys as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day that they sold food. So not only are they not tithing the way they should, are they not preparing and supporting the Levites the way they should, but they're breaking the Sabbath. If there's anything that is part of the old law, I mean, that is just picture example. Don't break the Sabbath. And they are. Oh, man. telling you, it's just so much. It's so good. Just really quick. So they're breaking the Sabbath. They're marrying foreigners who are not proselytes. And so he has to sort of set them straight. So really quickly, because I know we're out of time, but look at this list right here. As amazing of a man that Nehemiah was, as amazing of a character that Nehemiah had, on this list specifically, Jesus perfected every single one of these points. He left a place of power, felt great compassion for his people. He prayed diligently. He revered his father. He led by serving in the utmost, right? He faced great opposition, greater than any of us can even imagine. And he left, but he's coming back in judgment. So I just ask that you think about your standing before God, because Jesus is so good. He has perfected everything that Nehemiah ever did. So thank you so much this morning. Your comments were amazing. I really appreciate you.